Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Life is uncertain. It's okay to feel stressed, anxious, worried, or frustrated. CalHope can help. Access CalHope's free and secure mental health resources. Call 833-317-4673 or live chat at calhope.org.
Dr. Travis Brown, what is This Medical Life all about?
This is the pursuit of knowledge as we learn about diseases from the ancient times to the present day. These are the stories of medicine.
Dr. Travis Brown, I can't help but note that this week your notes are on papyrus instead of paper. Why is that?
It's honor of this episode, so we're talking about Egyptian mummification. This is the great thing about doing this podcast is being able to sort of just dive into some topics that I've always wanted to study and I've always wanted to look at. And Egyptian mummification, I always thought you were a mummy's boy. Well, we'll find out some interesting terms for mummies through this episode, but no, I think there's something about ancient Egypt that always caught my imagination. And this is one of those times where I can just delve into it. And you know, when you look at the medicine side of things, it's quite fascinating. You know, they have the Egyptian god of medicine was Heka, and he accompanied Ra, the sun god, in his solar boat across the skies. Each day. He would, this trip across the heavens, and he would ward off, evil spirits and demons.
So their medicine god was more like a locum and would travel to where you are.
Yeah, well, certainly, each day would go there. And then he was present at the creation of the world, and he could be summoned during rituals, religious rituals. But his chief function was preservation of the natural order. And what myth has it is he, fought and conquered 2 serpents. And so in hieroglyphics, he is the man carrying a staff with a knife, but the staff has the intertwined 2 serpents, which is his symbol of power and has come through to medicine to us to this day. And so the staff and the knife are the tools of the healer. And what happened from there is we have the link now for ancient Egyptians between, health and disease and the gods. And, this leads into where the priests and priestess were inherently linked to God and healing. And, this may sound a little bit unusual, but this was not uncommon for the time. And that's the thing, even a lot of the religions would have linked this. So Moses with the 10 plagues of Egypt.
I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah, so he had, the God, the Hebrew God of Moses. It wasn't just health. This was of weather and crops. So you've got the water, being turned to blood, and hail, locust, boils. So, disease, and then death of the firstborn. So this was, their interpretation. You have the book of Job, where he was a man of pure heart, but he was beset upon by Satan and given, all unfortunate events. And this was divinely inspired. This was the way they dealt with disease.
It's the book of Job is the whole reason I actually keep a Bible in my house, because if ever I'm feeling too good.
Well, that's right. And, and then you go to the Quran, they talk about their teachings. You read, listen, learn, and believe. And this cures all illnesses and diseases, and both physical and spiritual. And so, it is said that, when I am ill, it is Allah who cures me. And so this is actually quite common. The difference that's probably unusual for us is that Egypt was polytheistic. So we're monotheistic, so we would pray to one God, whereas they would actually pray to many gods. And so it would depend on which god that you were seeking either their intervention or their assistance with.
Allied heaven practitioners.
So there you go. And so their root cause of disease was supernatural. And so healers would determine what the supernatural intervention was and what it was attacking of the body, and then they would try and seek healing for that. And so a sick person was asked, well, what were they experiencing and what they may have done to cause that illness, or who have they upset? So
it doesn't. Oh, okay. Imagine the doctor coming around and giving you a guilt trip.
Well, it was trying to find out. So while ancient Egyptian healers were very knowledgeable, they actually had accumulated thousands of years of knowledge through, and what we can see is their papyrus. Now, their method to medicine was actually quite simple. It's, can I treat this disease? Or can I contend with this disease? Or there's nothing I can do with this disease. And so that was actually what they were asking. And so then, if they could do something or they could contend with the disease, they would have a bit of a diagnosis, they would have a prescription and an incantation. And so this was the ritual they went through. Now, if we look at some of the papyri that's come through to us, the most famous one is the Eber papyrus, and this is a medical papyrus. Now, this was found in 1875 by George Ebers. Now, it's 20 meters in length. It's about 30 centimeters in height. There's 108 columns of text. So it's about 110 pages long. So this is an ancient Egyptian medical textbook, effectively. And it was dated around 1500 BCE. And there's actually some further back information from it from, 3000 BCE. So we're talking this is over 5,000 years old.
Wouldn't you and most of our listeners who are GPs or specialists love the fact that a textbook while you were doing medical studies was only 108 pages long?
Well, we have a few other ones as well, but this would be, I guess, the physician's guide to, and the information is somewhat chaotic. So this is clearly gathered from several sources. But it talks about remedies in what we would say of medical conditions today. So there's something that is similar to what we'd call asthma. What they did with asthma? Well, they would have a mixture of herbs, put it on a heated brick, and the patient would inhale the fumes.
Oh.
There was an evacuation of the belly, which I'm gathering is purging. They would have one portion of cow's milk, one portion of grain, one portion of honey. They would mash it, sift it, and cook it, and then you would take 4 portions of this. There was a remedy for the bowels, and this is, someone would take one portion of millet, which is from the pea family, and one date. They would cook it in oil, and then they would anoint the sick part.
You'd pay a fortune for that in a vegan restaurant today.
And then you would have clothing. So if you wanted to collect so again, it's not just medical, this is life. If you wanted to protect your clothing against mice and rats, you would apply cat fat to it. And so or leave the cat alive and it will protect your clothing. That's hocus pocus what you're talking right there. It's not in the papyrus. And so then what we've got is things like, and you get to the point, where they had cancer, something, a tumor against the god of Zenus. Now, they actually would say, there's nothing you can do against this. So this patient was going to die. However, you could help treat or prevent death by having half an onion and the froth of beer. And this was a delightful remedy against death.
Our former Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, must have a great deal of protection.
And then, there's something called the Nile pimple, a skin condition, which we'll come back to in a little bit. But this is effectively cutaneous leishmaniasis. And so this is a skin condition that's transmitted through sandflies. But there are some... Now, remember, this is a warring nation. They are fighting against neighbours, they are defending, and they also are being... trying to take territory. And they were very successful. But remember, this is thousands of years of a culture of fighting. And so they would have been experts at dealing with wounds. And part of this includes some of the wound management for patients and soldiers.
Wound to the throat. If you examine a man with a gaping wound in his throat that pierces through to his gullet, so that if he drinks water he chokes and it comes out of the mouth of his wound, and it is greatly inflamed so that he develops fever from it, then you should bind that wound with bandaging. You should then say of him, suffering a wound in his throat, piercing through to his gullet, an illness which I can treat. Then you should pad it with fresh meat the first day, and treat it afterwards with oil, honey, and lint every day until he recovers. If you find him still feverish from that wound, then you should apply for him dry lint in the mouth of his wound, and have him rest lying down until he recovers.
So the papyri is often named after the people who either discovered it or found it. And the next one was Edwin Smith papyrus. Now this is considered a surgical papyrus. This was discovered in 1862 in Luxor in Egypt. And this is pretty much case presentations of surgical cases. It talks about wound closure and, preventing or curing infection, where oddly enough they use things like honey and moldy bread. So we're not quite sure if that's actually an early prelude of penicillin. You never know. And they would use raw meat to stop bleeding. They certainly used immobilization and were experts at, wounds with, either head and spinal injuries. And they actually had detailed illustrations of, heart vessels, liver, spleen, kidneys. Again, these are people who did mummification, so they would have actually a really good working knowledge of anatomy. Their physiology, though, was pretty primitive and off base, really, because they had, they believed there was some vessels. The vasculature, some would bring air and some would bring mucus. The two vessels to the right ear was the breath of life, whereas the two vessels to the left ear was the breath of death. And so their presentation was still the same. So they were actually, would assess wounds or surgical cases and say, this is either favorable or uncertain or unfavorable and not to be treated. And so an interesting omission from this papyrus, though, is amputations. And every culture did amputations, but they actually don't mention it in here, which is sort of, I'm not quite sure why it wasn't there, but you would think with...
Yeah, I don't actually picture amputation as being an Egyptian thing. It just is outside, but it must have been. If they were such a militaristic, they would have come up from time to time.
Just in war. So that's where I'm like, did they not, or just do we not have evidence of it? So, and this brings us to an interesting papyrus. This is Kahun papyrus, which is essentially a gynecological papyrus. Now, this was written in 1825 BCE, so several thousand years, and it's 34 paragraphs, and it also has that three-tiered approach. And there is an example of this.
Of a woman whose eyes are aching till she cannot see, on top of aches in her neck, it is discharges of the womb in her eyes. By fumigating her with incense and fresh oil, fumigating her womb with it, and fumigating her eyes with goose leg fat, you should have her eat a fresh ass liver.
And so this is... this goes back to episode 19 of This Pathological Life, where we're talking about, the wandering womb and, womb discharge. Terror of the womb is also another phrase that is used.
I can't wait to be traveling in America again and going to a diner and saying, I don't want this. I want some fresh ass liver.
Well, there you go. Well, it'll cure any womb problems you might have, Steve. So that's good. But again, the interesting part about this is there's no mention of surgery in this. So this is mainly fumigation and massage, and oil. And before we sort of discard this, I'll take a bit of an aside. And in 2014, researchers studied, post pain, post migraine. And they put 3 groups together. And one group, they gave tablets that were labelled with the drug on it. A second group were given tablets with placebo labelled on it. And a third group was given nothing. Now, what they found was that people taking the placebo had 50% effectiveness as the real drug. So we already know when we do trials, you do a double blind, and the placebo has an effect of about 10 to 20% depending on the study. And so what does this mean? It means that it's not just the treatment, but it's the ritual of a treatment that can be very effective. So were these people being helped even though it sounds completely ridiculous to us? The answer is yes. So this process that they were going through to treat whatever they thought they were treating would have helped their patients in some of the cases.
The challenge, I suppose, is knowing when does the theatre help and when do you actually need efficacious intervention with some sort of active ingredient.
And that's it. And this is the power of the mind. But imagine going to the high priest for your illness that you were having trouble with, and they then intervene with you with the most powerful God and do an incantation for you. And this is where these people were at. And so if you can imagine, if you feel better, if you think that you've been interceded with the high priest to the high God, how much would have that helped? So, and the other important thing that I think is easy to lose sight of is Egyptian medicine wasn't just for this life. It was for the afterlife. And so death was about preserving the body for the afterlife.
That would really change the indemnity schemes, wouldn't it?
Well, again, you were going somewhere else. And so, the mummification process started in 5600 BCE, but it was probably perfected around 2600 BCE. And so what did they do? Well, it was a process that took 70 days. And what they ended up doing was the body would come. First of all, they would remove internal organs. So except for the heart was the center of a person's being and their intelligence. The heart remained in place. But they would take out most of the other internal organs. And then what they would do is most people will be familiar with the canopic jars. And so they had the 4 sons of Horus with, one was human head, Imsetsi, which was the guardian of the liver. So liver would go into that. You had one with the baboon head, which was Happy, which was the guardian of the lungs. You had the jackal head, which was Duamnutef, which was looked after the stomach. And then you had the falcon head, which, let's see if I can say this, Cubensenuef.
Oh, that was magnificent pronunciation.
I'm sure I'm offending a lot of Egyptians right at the moment, so I apologize. And these were the guardians of the intestines. Now, this was where the organs would go, and eventually they became symbolic. It wasn't necessarily, but either the jars were either then placed back in the abdomen or were set aside. The interesting thing about all of this is they would remove the brain with a hook, and then they discarded the brain. So it was not considered important to preserve. And so that's where they put their focus on the heart.
They've really foreshadowed our era of social media, haven't they?
And so what happened then is they would preserve the body. So they would actually get a whole bunch of chemical salt, which is called natron. So the body would then be filled with this natron and covered in it, which would dehydrate the body and then it would preserve it and protect against pests. And so this was their process for preserving the body for the afterlife. And so what ended up happening is after those 70 days, the body would be washed, it would be oiled, and it would be covered in resin. And then linen, bandages, were wrapped around the body. And sometimes, depending on who it was and depending on how much money they had, jewels could be placed in between layers and protective amulets could be placed in between the layers. And then you would get more linen. And so why was this important? because the afterlife was not guaranteed. And so a dead person had to negotiate their way through the dangerous journey to get to the afterlife through.
They had to do all that negotiation with their hands bound.
And so they had a whole bunch of inscriptions. They had incantations and spells written around them and in their tomb, on their sarcophagus, and these were instructions to guide them. And this was, they had to take everything from this life into the next life. So you could set up luxuries, you could have foods, you could have everything you needed to take with you, because if you didn't have anything, you had nothing in the afterlife. And so families would purchase furniture, texts like the Book of the Dead, food, clothing, and something called a Shabbatus, which was a small funeral statuette. Eventually, it replaced what was servant statuettes, and in the afterlife, you could use incantations and spells to bring them to life and then do work for you. So this was how you showed your love to those who were passed on. You would give them gifts to the afterlife, and the most common amulet was the heart scarab, which was most widely used, and this was placed over the heart of the deceased, and it would stop their body being separated from their heart in the afterlife. And so this, and because again the heart contained all their records of a person's life, again, if their body didn't get lost to their heart, then they had their memories, they had their purpose. So
to their heart's content.
Yep. And so then you had the coffin, the sarcophagus, and this was covered in prayers and spells to protect the body. And so we then takes us to the tomb. This was the house of eternity. So if it was built correctly, it was a life-restoring power, and it provided immortality for the person. And so this is why tomb raiding, even back in those days, was such a grievous crime. There is actually a papyrus called the Amherst papyrus, and this was 1100 BCE. This is a court document of 8 thieves who raided the tomb of Sobekemsaf II. And they have one thief in there, Amenephar, who was a stonemason from the temple of Amun-Ra, who, quote, lost his way in tomb raiding. And what's happened is they stole gold, silver, precious stones, stripped the mummies and jewels. So this was both a king and queen that they were stealing from, and they set fire to the coffins. And so their punishment was death via impalement.
Oh.
And so there's probably no greater crime than you could do, because you are not just, you're affecting eternity for these people. And so that's when we look at these things as a healer and a priest was for this life and for the afterlife. Someone was taking care of your body now, but also your body later. And so that is where we find it, that these mummies give us evidence of today of what we can see and understand about human life back then.
I'm going to grab myself a handful of precious little stones to protect me through the rest of this episode. Just come back in a moment. Travis, at the end of the last part of this show, we were talking about the mummies inside the pyramids and what they do and people raiding them. Now we're going to sift through the diseases.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. So because the bodies are so well preserved, we can actually go through and techniques in the last few decades, we can do imaging of mummies without having to destroy them, and by cutting them apart and actually seeing physically. So things have advanced a lot, and it's fascinating what we find. Look, there are some things that we do find in the bodies that are, direct, observation. And, there's things like parasitic eggs that we find in bodies.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's things like schistosomiasis, calcified eggs that have been found in things like, kidneys, liver, intestine, bladder. These are diseases that exist to this day, thousands of years. We know how to treat it now. And the fortunate thing is they may not have even known they were infected because a lot of these conditions are asymptomatic. We have cysticercosis, which is tapeworm. And so we know that existed. We also have trichuris, ascaris. Again, lots of parasitic infections. They don't have our anti-parasitic medication, so they just would have existed with it. So they wouldn't.
I'm so glad I got up early to record this.
So we know back then things like tuberculosis was about. And we also know things like, because we do have livers and gallbladders, gallstones common. And so that's the information. Now, when we look at the thing that we discussed with the Eber papyrus, the Nile pimple, there's a 4,000-year-old mummy with, leishmaniasis, but we can see it in their bone, which means it's visceral, which is is advanced and, a lot of the time fatal disease, but this is what we can see in these mummies. They had lots of infectious diseases that, wouldn't be able to be treated effectively. So we also know there's just normal systemic diseases. In episode 42 of This Path Life, we talk about cholesterol. We know that they had atherosclerosis, and coronary artery disease that we had. This is not a modern disease. This has been with us throughout time. What we know from the mummies that were examined is just what you expect. The older you get, the more likely you are to have atherosclerosis. And so where we get a little bit of deviation, though, is their dentition.
What?
So their teeth.
Oh, okay.
Their teeth. So one of the most common findings in mummies is worn teeth. They had periodontal problems. Lots of dental abscesses, and this would have been agonizing. And the physicians and the healers, they weren't dentists, and so managing this problem would have been very difficult.
So worn teeth, is that from having very bad cooks and you're chewing tough food, or is it grinding through stress? What?
No. So what they have in their food was lots of inorganic matter. So they would grind up wheat and they would have things like stone and quartz in their bread that they would then grind. Sand was also be a problem blown about, but they also had soil, which was mixed into their food that was probably not sieved out.
You'd pay a lot for that in a vegan restaurant too.
And so not only that, there is Pliny, who's a Roman writer. He writes about corn that was intentionally mixed with either brick, chalk, and sand to help the grinding up of it. And that would have gone in your food. And so this then wears down your teeth and you would have had lots of dental problems. And
good roughage, though.
Well, the problem is they couldn't have done anything with it. So it might have been good for the bowels. So you'd go to the Eber papyrus to, evacuate your bowels. This would have helped, but the teeth took a big toll. And so the other thing that's quite interesting is cancer seems to be quite rare, and we don't have lots of evidence. We do know that there's things like prostate cancer and breast, even multiple myeloma, but we don't have lots of evidence that it was widespread, and probably because they had other things that would kill them before time going into the cancer. So the other significant difference was joint and bone disease, but not from bone disease, but broken bones. And so they had a much more manual labor life, and so they had joints wears and tears, and so particularly osteoarthritis of knees and ankles. And so we've got lots of disease in that area. These people just had to, go everywhere, walk everywhere. We do know that some of the, affluent would have had chariots or, but for the majority of people, you had to walk to your job.
When they said I'm running to the shops, they meant that.
And so what they had was even skilled workers had signs of wear and tear. And there was a study of the bodies of the village of the kings of artisans. So these were highly skilled labourers. They were highly literate. And so what would happen, and why would these people who were skilled and probably not lifting a whole heap, why would they had so much joint or bone issues, is because even where they were situated near the Valley of the Kings, they had to climb effectively a 28-story building each day just to get to their work. And so that's up and down into the Valley of the Kings. And they would do that for as long as they worked, which was 10, 20 years or so. And so, this was effectively your commute.
Mm.
And you had to walk to work.
I wonder if they would have had ergonomic desks and chairs.
So I imagine health and safety was probably very different back then. Yeah. Oddly enough, there is even the world's first strike that is documented in Ramesses III, who we come to soon. The world's first strike where they wanted back pay and wouldn't get back pay, and then so they didn't work. Amazing stuff that the Egyptians just documented, which is remarkable. But that tells us about the disease. But things didn't go they even got a bit weirder in the 12th century onwards, from when their civilization had pretty much, the ancient Egyptians had died out. They still weren't safe from us. And this is because if you went to the apothecary in 12th century, on the shelves were bits of Egyptian mummy, either bits and pieces or ground up mummy, that was a medicine. Now, this was known as mummy medicine. Oh. And so it was thought back then that bitumen, a petroleum product, was healthy to take as medicine. It would help you. And now we associate bitumen with asphalt and, roads. But back then, they believed it could help, and it would treat things, everything from headaches to epilepsy. And so whilst they thought it was bitumen, it was actually resin that looked like bitumen. And so people would take bits of mummy as medicine, or ground up bits of mummy as medicine to help them with their ailment at the time.
What happened to the whole thing about not touching the mummies? Order in the court. Please arise for the judge, Dr. Travis Brown.
So this is about a trial that was in 1155 BCE, so over 3,000 years ago. It's a story about Ramesses III, who was considered the great bull, the great king, considered probably the last great pharaoh before Egypt plunged into chaos. So from a historical point of view. He was a powerful warrior. He fought off two foreign invasions, one from Libya and another from the mysterious sea people of the Mediterranean, which no one knows who they are, but they were very powerful people. And his reign was for 31 years, and the most interesting part and the most relevant part of this is he had a large harem. And this was just a people and a place. The harem was kind of like the royal family. So this was his wives and children. And this was the royal family. Now in 1800s, there was a papyrus found. Again, a market at Luxor. Now this papyrus had been cut into pieces to sell. And fortunately, they were able to get these pieces together. And this document formed what we call the Judicial papyrus of Turin. And it tells of a harem conspiracy story.
Ooh.
And it's a court trial. And this isn't any ordinary papyrus. The writing is very large, and it's well-formed signs and symbols that are up to 30 millimeter high. So this isn't just a document. This is a declaration. This is an announcement. And it tells of 4 trials. 31 men are named, and it includes the king's physician, an army commander, a royal magician, accused of trying to overturn the royal bark.
The royal bark.
The royal bark. And so the accused fit into 3 categories. Firstly, there's you're overly friendly with the accused.
Oh.
Secondly, you were aware of the plot, but you didn't report it.
Mm-hmm.
And thirdly, you were actively plotting against the pharaoh. And so what does this document tell us? Well, it tells us the punishment meted out. And so those who were overly friendly category had a few different punishments. One of them had a verbal warning. There was no act against this person, but they were given a verbal warning. 4 were given the sentence of mutilation, which meant either cutting off noses or cutting off ears, or both. And then there was 1 forced suicide in this category.
Oh, that's a very extreme version of a forced confession, isn't it?
Well, look, it gets more interesting.
Oh, okay.
So then there was those who were aware of the crime but didn't report it.
Mm-hmm.
9 of them were executed and 3 were forced to suicide. And then of those who plotted against the pharaoh, it's an interesting aside that we'll come back to. 7 were executed and 7 were forced suicide.
What is the difference?
Forced suicide is more honourable than an execution.
Right.
And so execution is the state taking your life. Forced suicide, or just suicide, is you taking your own. The distinction back then is not as it is now, but it's more honourable to kill yourself than the state to kill you.
Yeah, semantic. I understand.
And so, in addition, 4 of those who were executed and 2 who were forced to have suicide had their names changed. And their names were changed to things like, the snake demon, Ra hates him, evil one of Thebes. Now, remember, this is changing their name for historical purposes. So their family would also have had name change. And so there was only 1 woman mentioned in this document. It's the wife of the pharaoh. Her name is Taya. Now, she is accused of leading this conspiracy. Now, it's implied that she is a lesser wife. But when we go a little bit further into it and we look at what we know today, the final resting place of Ramesses III is KV11. Now, his tomb was found in the 18th century. Now, it is a huge tomb. It's 180 metres wide. It's 262 feet. There's corridors, there's pillared halls, there's a burial chambers, there's annexes, and it's beautifully decorated. There's lots of inscriptions, lots of texts like Ra or the Book of Gates, the opening of the mouth ritual. So when someone dies, they do this ritual to pass them into the underworld and to start their journey. You have the Book of the Earth and Heavenly Cow. And so these are all texts that are important into your journey into the afterlife. There was the sarcophagus, which is large red quartzite. And again, that is beautifully decorated with all texts and inscriptions. The tomb held bodies of princes, princesses, queens, some priests, all embalmed. But there was one person found in a wooden box. And archaeologists and scientists have called this person E. Just the letter E.
For environmentalist.
And so the initial examination of Ramesses III happened in the 1960s, where they unwrapped him. He was unwrapped before then, but where they examined him for medical purposes. And the images were X-rays. The conclusion at this time was Ramesses III died of natural causes. However, there were a few clues that suggest there was more to this story. the linen bandages around Ramses III's leg were so secure they couldn't be removed. Also, the wrappings around his neck couldn't be removed. And then there was this mystery of E. There was no markings, there was no carvings, there was no indications of who this was. So why was a nobody sitting in the king's tomb? And so...
Can I have a guess?
Well, hold on to that guess.
Okay.
We'll see if you're right.
Yeah.
And so in 2009, we return back to the body of Ramses III with all of our CT imagery. And so we can get a lot more thorough investigation of the body. What did they find? They found on his left foot, the large left toe was missing. Instead of the large left toe, the embalmers had made a prosthetic toe out of linen. And then they embalmed the foot with lots and lots of resin so that the bandages couldn't be removed. There was no evidence of healing, so this occurred at his time of death. It had been taken off by an axe. Around his neck, there was a large wound directly under his larynx, which was 70 millimeters wide. So a big cut. All the soft tissue in the anterior neck had been cut. All the major blood vessels, the esophagus, and the trachea had been separated by about 30 millimeters. The cut went through to the 5th to 7th cervical vertebrae. This was a large wound.
Eber's papyrus would tell them how to cure that.
I don't think there was much of a cure for this one. And not only that, in the wound itself was an amulet. It was the Eye of Horus, which is a symbol of royal power, protection, and good health. The problem was, this is clearly a violent and bloody death for the great pharaoh of Egypt. Which then takes us to the body of E, who has also been termed the screaming mummy. And this is because its head's back and its mouth is open, and it looks as if it's screaming. The body had not been cleaned, or oiled, nor wrapped. The hands and feet looked like it had been tied. The body had just been sprinkled with salt, wrapped in goat skin, which is ritually impure, and stuffed into a wooden box. None of their organs had been taken out. And what they found was there was folds and wrinkles around the neck, and the chest was overly inflated. This was suggestive of strangulation, which brings us back to the Judicial papyrus of Turin. The charge is overturning the royal bark. This was them trying to change the line of succession. And so we have Queen Taya, who was portrayed as a lesser queen. However, to change the line of succession, you have to be in the line of succession. And so if Queen Taya was taking the throne for herself, this is rebellion. This is not changing the line. And so was she a low wife? Chances are she wasn't. So the problem is, this conspiracy was not only to kill the pharaoh, it was to kill those in the line of succession to claim the throne. So if you're 15th in line, there's 14 people to take out before you get there. So who does the Judicial papyrus of Turin name? They name Queen Taya as the chief conspirator, and her co-conspirator, her son, Pentawere. And so the body of E in the tomb of Ramses III has the genetic makeup, 50% genetic material is shared with Ramses III, and they have the same Y chromosome. And the body is that of an 18 to 20-year-old. This is a father-son relationship. So
Not a healthy one.
No, not a healthy one at all. So this was a powerful group of Egyptians coming together who ambushed the pharaoh. His left foot got struck with an axe, taking off the left big toe. A blade slashed his throat, killing him, and he died. And the two top conspirators is Queen Taea and Prince Pentawere. So we then have two stages of this conspiracy. The first is to kill the current pharaoh. The second would be to kill anyone who was in that line of succession before. And we have Queen Taea and Prince Pentawere. And so what does that tell us? We have a pharaoh who has been assassinated by a wife and a son. They would have then had to have killed the new pharaoh in the line of succession, because we actually have reliefs showing Pentawere and who would soon be Ramesses IV with their father Ramesses III. And in later reliefs, he's not there anymore. He's been replaced. And so this was the Harem conspiracy. This was a document declaring this is what's happened and this is the punishment that's happened to them. As we discussed, clearly those who didn't declare the conspiracy seem to be more punished than those who were actively involved. But I think that's because those who were involved were probably royal family, and it's much better PR to say they killed themselves, still had an honourable death, than to say they were killed. And again, the execution, as you'd know, is
the son.
Impalement.
Oh, sorry. Yes.
And so this is the worst crime that you can do. And so where does that tell us? Well, tying all of this together, the problem is, aside from Queen Taea being declared a co-conspirator, we don't know what happened to her. There is no mention of what happened to her punishment. So, but it seems the punishment for Pentawere, the person who was second in line, he didn't have a funeral. He had a non-royal burial. He did not have the Book of the Dead guide, no Book of Gates, no Book of the Earth, no opening of the mouth ritual. He didn't have any departed messages, no gifts, no food, no luxuries. His body was left with organs intact to decompose. He was placed in an unmasked box to be forgotten in the tomb of the father who he murdered. There was no guide for him to the journey of the underworld. So his death was a punishment for this life. His burial was the punishment for the afterlife.
This Medical Life is recorded in the Talked About Marketing Studios in Adelaide. For show notes and more information about the podcast, visit thismedicallife.com.au. You can contact the hosts via Twitter. Dr. Travis Brown is at Dr. Travis Brown. That's DR for doctor. And Steve Davis is at Steve Davis. Editing and production is by Tim Whiffen. Design is by Tom Buzenjut. This has been a Pathnotes Proprietary Limited production.
Life is uncertain. It's okay to feel stressed, anxious, worried, or frustrated. It's normal. With CalHope's free and secure mental health resources, it's easy to get the help you and your loved ones need when you need it the most. Call our warm line at 833-317-4673 or live chat at calhope.org today.
Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.